Fear Not, Episode 134. Hi, I'm Billy Atwell, and I believe that consistently facing your fears is the only way to realize your truest self and to make those confident choices that will help you to obtain your deepest held hopes and dreams. I have faith that this podcast series will show you that you are not alone, that it will strengthen you and give you courage to face your fears, and that it will help you to permanently cross over into a life of living beyond your fears. Join me on this journey as we listen and learn from others as they share their experiences in facing and overcoming their own fears. Hello, everybody. Today, you and I are going to be joined by Stephen Hinshaw. Welcome, Stephen. How are you today?
I'm really good. Thanks for having me on board.
Yeah, the pleasure's all mine. Stephen is professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, where he was department chair from 2004 through 2011. He's also professor of psychiatry and vice chair for child and adolescent psychology at the University of California, San Francisco. His work focuses on developmental psychopathology, clinical interventions with children and adolescents, particularly mechanisms underlying therapeutic change, and mental illness stigma. He's been featured regularly in the media, including New York Times, The Today Show, the CBS Evening News, ABC World News Tonight, CNN, and many more. Stephen, can you take a few moments to fill in those gaps and maybe also give us a brief glimpse of your personal life?
So I'm really glad you asked, and I'll start from the beginning. So I grew up in the Midwest, back in Columbus, Ohio, in what seemed like an idyllic academic family. My father was a philosopher. When he was a graduate student at Princeton, he had studied for a time with Bertrand Russell, who was on sabbatical from England, and got to know Albert Einstein and wrote a chapter on Einstein's social and moral philosophy. He met my mother, who was a graduate student in history, when he was an assistant professor in Ohio State. So my sister and I and mom and dad grew up in Columbus. Seems like it's kind of an ideal life, right? Well, except every once in a while, for 3 months, 6 months, or up to a year at a time, my dad would disappear, vanish, as though abducted by aliens. No one talked about it. We didn't know where he was. My mom wouldn't really answer my sisters or my questions. He would come back half a year later as though nothing had happened, seemingly normal, and we weren't allowed to again talk about where he'd been. So at the same time, as I was playing sports and doing academics and having this Midwestern existence, my life was encased in this mysterious, sometimes terrifying bubble of what was going on. Now, what I didn't know until I was 18 and had returned home for my first spring break from college, went back to Columbus for what I thought would be a kind of inconsequential week in Ohio before I got back to my studies at Harvard. My dad pulled me aside, took me into a study, and started to talk about what I had never learned before. And what I learned was that his very doctors, when my sister and I were young, had told him explicitly, you can never tell your children about the reasons for your disappearances because of your serious mental illness, what they thought was schizophrenia, hearing voices, wild episodes of behavior, and going into, back in the 50s and 60s, very snake pit-like mental hospitals. The doctors had said, again explicitly, if your children learn of the reason for your disappearances, they'll be permanently destroyed. So this was the doctor-enforced silence that I grew up in and didn't know anything about it till I was 18. Of course, I suspected the worst. I didn't know what was happening. And that's what got me, that first discussion my dad and I had, and many more for the next 25 years until he passed away, got me interested in psychology and mental health and mental illness. And I did all this volunteer work in college, working with kids. I think I identified with lonely kids or kids who might not have been thriving. What did my sister and I do when we were little in the midst of all this? Well, we blamed ourselves. Maybe if we'd been better kids, Dad wouldn't go away. Or maybe he'd come back sooner once he was gone. When kids in a family know that something's wrong, but there's nothing talked about, rather than just believing the world's a cruel, random place, kids tend to internalize, take on the blame. You'd think that's pretty devastating to self-esteem, but having some control may be better than having no control at all. So moving forward, I became a psychology major and went into clinical psychology, have done research, clinical studies, and studying how kids develop typically and atypically. But over the years, inspired by the final truth I heard from my dad, I not only diagnosed him correctly with bipolar disorder not long out of college, but as I've become a professor, an educator, an advocate, and researcher, I've become more and more interested in not just how the brain develops in healthy and atypical ways, but why this silence is still so pervasive. Here in the United States, we know a lot more about mental illness factually, the general public does, than 50, 60 years ago. But our attitudes are just as stigmatizing, if not more, than back in the silent 1950s. So I'm very interested in stigma and in shame and what we might do. Kind of, it's a dual-barreled approach. What we might do to promote healthier development, brain development, social development, cognitive development, and I think this is one of your key themes. Why are we still so afraid? What's the fear of disclosing mental illness? It's very common. It's very impairing. But if we treat it, people get really better. But if it's never discussed, services aren't sought. We continue to fund mental health at a different level from physical health, and we end up with shame and silence rather than the openness and treatment we need. So that's filling in some of my backstory and why I'm doing what I do today.
Well, that's what I was hoping we could discuss today, or rather you discuss, is this stigma, that surrounds it. And I'm also fascinated by the brain plasticity as well, and your concepts of mechanism of change. So why don't we go ahead and get started?
Please, let's do.
Well, could you maybe start off by helping us to understand what you've learned about brain plasticity?
So plasticity is sort of a funny term in some ways. Well, it's plastic. What does that mean? Does it mean it's fake? Or no, it means that, like plastics, you get them to a certain temperature and they're malleable and moldable and you can form any shape you want. So what does this have to do with brains? Well, for a long time, much of the history of neuroscience, it was thought that we human beings have this long time of gestation and long time of sort of innocent childhood as our brains develop. And then once our brains develop, that's it. We're born with a fixed number of neurons. We actually lose neurons in our early years as synaptic connections form. And then that's it. We're stuck with those brains for the rest of our lives, and we kind of peak in adolescence and early adulthood and go downhill from there. Well, in fact, throughout development, the brain is incredibly plastic. It's moldable, not just from the genetic instructions in every cell in our body with the DNA, but through experience. Experience literally shapes the structure of our brain, and not just the structure and size, but crucially, the connections, the pathways that form. Maybe in most adult brains, there's a little under 100 billion neurons. That's a big number. But many of those neurons have 1,000, even 10,000 connections with other neurons. If you start to multiply this out by doing exponential multiplication, that's a huge, almost unfathomable number of synaptic interconnections. Probably most of us have 100 trillion plus synapses in our brain where one neuron talks to another. Back in utero and during the earliest years of development, when the brain is really wiring and rewiring itself, when we're born, we've got 200 billion neurons, not 90 billion. half of those neurons don't stay permanently lodged in our brain, which is a good thing. Only the neurons that, again, because of genes and because of experiences, form healthy connections with other neurons, neurons that fire together, wire together, is the old adage here. Now we've got pruning. The brain is becoming more efficient. So let's talk further about plasticity and an issue I'm very interested in, kids who develop attention deficits and hyperactivity. We'll talk about the cortex of the brain. So cortex is an interesting word. In Greek, it means bark. So the brain's cortex is like the bark of a tree. It's just that outer coating. So the brain has, again, nearly 100 billion neurons, and it's rich and dense, but its outer layer, the cortex, is only a few millimeters thick. But within those few millimeters, let's just bear with me for a minute. Think of a cubic millimeter. So think of a millimeter ruler. A millimeter is a tenth of a centimeter. It's just this little unit of length. So a cubic millimeter is a little box, a millimeter by a millimeter by a millimeter. It's a little tiny box. How many neurons lie within a cubic millimeter of brain tissue? Millions upon millions. The brain's the most complex thing we know of in the universe. Maybe we'll discover through astrophysics more complex evolved structures. But again, this cortex, the outer layer, especially the frontal cortex, think of behind your forehead. The frontal lobes are the regions of the brain and their connections with the rest of the brain where executive functions lie. Not just how smart you are, but how you wake up and plan a day. And if things don't go well, you change gears, and you have to stop distractions from impinging on your goals. These are what we neuropsychologists call executive functions. The prefrontal cortex, this outer layer of the prefrontal lobes of the brain, reaches its maximum thickness by the time kids are about 5, 6, 6.5 years of age. It's interesting that millennia ago, when civilizations formed, education started right around that time. There was no brain scanning then, but cultural elders knew that this is the time when kids were going to really learn, when this cortex has reached this maximum thickness. And then later in childhood and through adolescence, the cortex actually thins out, becoming more efficient. Again, there's pruning of the neurons that aren't forming connections. Fascinatingly, for kids with classic ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, their prefrontal cortex doesn't reach its maximum thickness until closer to 10 rather than 6.5 years of age. It's a 3.5-year delay. Whether this is because of genes or whether it's because of experiences or some combination, still not sure. Then during adolescence, when some of the symptoms of ADHD go underground, fidgeting tends to lessen, but directing your attention and becoming independent, those are key things that happen in the teen brain. If you've got attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you're still delayed in this brain maturation. So the brain is plastic. It's developing through experience. For some conditions that lead to mental health problems, a combination of some genetic vulnerability and probably not getting the educational experiences you need because of the lagging behind in brain development, we find that the plasticity is altered in some way. The goal of all of psychology and psychiatry and neurology in many ways is how do we enhance brain plasticity to keep the brain evolving over our lifespan the way it should, and to overcome what some people are born with, a genetic liability that brain development won't go in the same trajectories as other people. But boy, if treatment's delivered, whether it's in some cases medication, family therapy, school-based intervention, we can really help reshape and rewire the brain to lead to much healthier outcomes.
So you could reshape the brain with someone who has mental illness, just like if a normal person like you creating a new habit?
So it's really interesting. Let's move from kids to adults with major depression. Depression can be crippling. It's very common. About 1 woman in 5 will develop major depression in her lifetime, and about 1 man in 10. If it gets severe enough, the person often thinks life isn't worth living. Suicide is a huge risk. Among the many things we know about depression, one is that the act of experiencing a major depression robs your brain of neurons in the hippocampus. This is an ancient part way below the cortex of the brain that's involved in emotion and memory. Depressions are a brain disease in this way where there's too much loss of these hippocampal neurons that literally impair your memory and impair your emotion regulation ability. If you get SSRI medications well delivered, or if you get evidence-based treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, brain scanning studies now show that you do not lose these hippocampal neurons the way you do if your depression is untreated and unchecked. So literally, medications and psychological treatments help resculpt the brain, preventing some of the neuronal loss associated with serious forms of mental illness. What does education do for the typically developing kid? Not just in grade school or kindergarten, but preschool. It's helping through language stimulation, through cognitive stimulation, through play. It's helping the brain to sculpt and wire itself, and that's what healthy development is all about. It's not biology, it's not experience, it's the combination of biology and experience together that literally wires and rewires our brains throughout development.
What else could you help us to understand about mental illness so, to remove the stigma?
Right. So this is a key question. There's many different forms of physical illness and many different forms of mental illness. Mental illnesses are based in the brain, but the body's involved too. We talked about major depression. There's a variant of depression called bipolar illness, where a person not only has depressed episodes, but manias, wild, erratic, sometimes grandiose behavior, can be quite dangerous because the impulsivity can really lead to suicide, even higher risk in bipolar disorder than in so-called unipolar depression. Thought disorders like schizophrenia, where there's a lot of psychotic hallucinations and delusions, and the person loses motivation in other aspects of life. Anxiety disorders. Substance abuse is considered a form of mental illness. Childhood conditions like ADHD, we just talked about, autism spectrum disorders. Putting these all together, mental illness isn't rare. Serious mental illness, where suicidal ideation and real loss of functioning probably occurs in about 1 in 20 citizens today. More moderate forms, now we're talking about up to a quarter of the population. And if you go into mild mental illnesses like specific phobias, across a lifetime, almost half the people in the U.S. will experience some form of mental illness. So what's the stereotype, though? The stereotype is that people with mental illness are raving lunatics. That was one of the names. Mental hospitals used to be called lunatic asylums, assuming that the phases of the moon cause strange behavior. From time immemorial, most cultures have viewed mental illnesses, in fact, as evil spirits or animal spirits or some deflection of, through supernatural processes, the brain from doing what it should do. For much of the 20th century, psychology said, well, actually mental illness is caused by bad parents. If you're not parented right, that's the cause of anxiety or depression or schizophrenia, etc. As we then moved in the last part of the 20th century into the genetic and genomic era, and through twin and adoption studies and molecular genetic investigations, we learned that genes, those portions of our DNA that create proteins and build brains, the genetic vulnerability for many forms of mental illness is quite high. In fact, some people would now say we should not use the term mental illness, we should just call it brain disease or brain illness. Now, there's some truth to that because the brain is the organ that helps generate emotions and feelings and cognitions, and it's highly involved, of course, in mental illness. But we don't remove stigma by simply saying, oh, it's a brain disease rather than a mental disease. In fact, when people behave irrationally or not according to developmental expectations, this generates fear. If I encounter somebody on the street who's muttering and homeless and they seem irrational and disheveled, maybe I'm not so sure about my own stability. So stigma, in part, is pushing away of this fear of the unknown, the fear of loss of control. You'd like to believe that if we can just attribute that to a brain disease, that's going to remove the stigma. Well, we tend to blame people less for their aberrant behavior if we think it's the result of a brain disease, but we also tend to give up hope because we think they're flawed at the level of their very DNA. Maybe these people aren't even fully human. I think the solution to stigma, that's going to take a lot of work to solve this huge riddle, but part of it is humanization. People with mental illnesses are people struggling to fight through depression, to fight through attentional problems or anxieties. If we view them as, because of genes, just the way in some families, heart disease is more prevalent than in other families because of genes related to blood flow and heart tissue, some people are more vulnerable to mental illnesses than others. But it's not just genes, it's lifestyle choice, and it's getting involved in treatment, and it's diet and exercise. If we take a holistic view, and if we realize that it's not a depressive or a schizophrenic or an autistic, but a person with depression or bipolar illness or schizophrenia or autism who himself or herself and whose family is really struggling and fighting to work through these symptoms and have a fuller life, that kind of contact, that kind of life story is really going to help, I think, eradicate stigma. Think 75 years ago, you didn't put in your obituary or for yourself you wrote or before you died or for a family member that cancer was the cause. Cancer was viewed as a weakness, a flaw you brought upon yourself. Today, breast cancer is a cause. The pro football players and golfers wear pink during big sporting events because we know the stories of women who bravely fight breast cancer. We still don't have the same humanization and life stories of people with mental illness. My brand new book that's coming out in June of 2017 is called Another Kind of Madness. It's the actual story of my childhood and my father's life and our family's life with that doctor-enforced silence, the changes I made once I learned the truth, and what it's going to take for our society and the rest of the world too to humanize mental health conditions rather than demonize them to overcome the stigma. If we don't do this, we're failing our families, we're failing our societies. Mental illnesses are here to stay. We don't have cures yet. If people get treatment, their lives can be far more fulfilling, but we won't get treatment and we won't do the right research if stigma and shame carry the day.
What can we do for those of us who live on the other side of mental illness, that don't have it, that we could implement into our lives that could, do our part to reduce the stigma? Right.
So, first of all, I'm going to challenge a little bit the first part of your statement. If you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there's categories, as I was defining before, of schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, ADHD. In fact, those are somewhat arbitrary categories. None of us pays perfect attention all the time. Some of us are more focused than others. But some people are pretty scattered in their attention, and if you drift over to the far end of the bell curve, maybe you've got ADHD. The same thing is true for regulating your moods. Depression isn't something that a few people have and other people absolutely do not have. Depressed mood's a dimension, and we all fall on some point in that continuum. Who among us has never been sad for a few days? It would be pretty rare. Mental illnesses are extremes of the kind of traits and behaviors and emotions that everybody experiences. I think understanding that alone might give us a little more empathy. It's not us versus the healthy, us versus them, the sick. We're all, and if you look back, certainly look back on my life with the genetic vulnerability my dad's bipolar disorder has given to me and my sister and my family, and those experiences of silence, sometimes my depressed moods last longer than a couple of days. Sometimes I get into little creative spurts. They're not full manias, but probably betraying some of my genetic legacy. We're all human. None of us has a perfectly ordered life. Understanding that, on the one hand, and then also understanding that there are some people whose genetic vulnerabilities and early experiences do put them far out on the continuum. It's your workmate, it's your best friend from grade school, it's your sister, it's your aunt, it's your father. In my case, my father with severe bipolar disorder. Families are vulnerable to mental illness because we're all humans, and mental illness is part of our gene pool and part of the stress of living the lives we live. If we shut it out, if we fear it, if we don't want to even think about irrational behavior or depression because it's too threatening to us, now we're into stigma. And now we're into literally cutting off our noses to spite our faces. If we can understand the essential humanity of people struggling with depression, struggling with attentional problems, struggling with hearing voices, the paradox of paradoxes is that treatments for mental illnesses now, sometimes medications, often psychological forms of treatment, are on average just as effective, if not even more so, than the average treatment for people with physical illnesses. We don't yet have cures. We don't know enough about the brain yet. But if we can get people with mental health conditions access to treatment, symptoms improve. Despair turns into hope. People with attentional struggles can learn to focus better and find the kinds of schools and jobs that suit their needs and their proclivities better. Back to your initial question, what can we do as a society? Recognize that we're all vulnerable, that empathy and compassion, rather than shutting out and fear, will open up our humanity to be more compassionate to ourselves, our classmates, our workmates, our family members, even ourselves, as we sometimes experience mental health conditions. Human potential rises if we understand that there's diversity, not only of skin color and religion, but diversity of behavior. Now, some people, again, with serious mental illness really do need treatment. These are illnesses. We can locate some of the origins in brain circuitry and underlying genetics. But if we fear it, we don't get access to treatment, and the cycle perpetuates. It's going to take contact, it's going to take empathy, and it's going to take narratives and people's ability to tell their stories, I think, to open up society to the reality of mental illness and mental health and empathizing with people's struggles.
Stephen, if someone would like to connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So I'm online now. I have an author website, www.stephenhinshawauthor.com. That's Stephen with a PH. Best way is just to send me an email right to my Berkeley campus address, Hinshaw, my last name, HINSHAW, at Berkeley, BERKELEY.edu, or Google me and you'll find other email addresses at UC San Francisco. What we need to do, again, is promote the best science about brain health, about mental illness, promote openness of communication, take away the fear that, man, I don't want to tell anybody I've been depressed. They'll think I'm weak. Most of the people you talk with, once you find a way to disclose, will empathize because they or their family members have undergone depression too. It's that common. If we can connect, and if people want to get in touch and find ways, some of the studies we're doing, some of the results we're publishing, the books I write about mental health and about resilience and family members, it's going to take a different level of openness, I think, to turn the tide. But we can do it. I'm confident we can do it.
Stephen, what parting advice could you give us today?
Brains develop through genetic influences. Brains develop through families and schools and cultures. Brains are plastic. People's brains can change with the right environments. Parting advice would be that, given that, and given the fear we still often display in the face of aberrant behavior, mental illness, openness, disclosure, acceptance, narrative, the telling of stories, if we can all realize our own vulnerabilities a bit more and show somewhat less fear to those vulnerabilities in ourselves and in others, we might create a local, regional, and national and worldwide dialogue about behavior and emotion and mental health that could help transform our societies and really develop human capital. So my parting advice would be openness, disclosure, and let's not shut these things out. Let's bring them under the tent so we can all deal with them.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank you, Stephen, for coming on the show today and really being generous with your knowledge and wisdom and giving us your time today. I thank you for that.
My pleasure, and thanks for your great questions.
Thank you for joining me today. And remember, you cannot achieve everything, but you do have the God-given ability to achieve anything. So stay focused, out of fear, and keep on keeping on. Until next time, be well and peaceful. For more information on today's episode and guest, or for resources that will assist you in overcoming your fears, visit livingbeyondyourfears.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, where 3 times a week we move to a life beyond our fears.